want to talk about money a bit because I see a lot of misconceptions about this and overall just some bad information. So how rich essentially can software engineers actually become? What is sort of the ceiling? And what do most software engineers actually end up making throughout their careers? And I think some of the data on this, no matter what your preconceived notions are, might actually surprise you a bit. So first, one of the biggest factors in how much a software engineer can actually make is simply just the location that they are actually based. So salaries in the United States are typically much higher than those pretty much anywhere else in the world, even places that are more expensive to live. And within the United States, there's still a lot of variance. So the highest paying software engineering jobs happen to be in cities that tend to be some of the most expensive cities. Specifically, San Francisco, New York City, and Seattle tend to be where most of the high-paying tech jobs are. Of course, there are exceptions. There are plenty of high-paying tech jobs elsewhere in the country, but the majority of them tend to be in those three cities or the sort of metro areas surrounding those cities. And generally speaking, you'll see people divide these into three categories. So high cost of living cities, like the ones I just mentioned, medium cost of living cities, which will be cities sort of like Austin, Texas, where the salaries are still going to be high, but not as high as something like San Francisco, and then low cost of living cities, where typically the salaries are going to be lower, but the cost of living is also much lower. And again, there are tons of exceptions, but for the most part, this tends to be the case. Alright, so I want to look at some actual data. So this is levels.fyi, which is a great tool just for tracking the general trends in software engineering and how much people are actually being paid. I found in my own experience, it tends to actually be very accurate because they have good data that's actually coming from software engineers. So this is their leaderboard, so the highest paying companies in different areas. So we're looking at software engineers in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the vast majority of the big tech companies tend to be based, and we're looking at entry-level positions. So these are 0 to 2 years of experience. So this would be a job you'd get directly out of college, or maybe after like 1 year of experience. And we can see the highest paying companies at this level are Roblox and Stripe, coming in at just shy of $250,000 per year. Now, a couple things to note here. This is not all cash compensation. This is not just your salary. So we can see the breakdown here. The base salary is actually $150,000, with $88,000 of it being stock, and then $9,000 of it being a bonus. So you can debate exactly how much that $88,000 in stock is actually worth. Is it worth the entire $88,000, or do you view that as less because it's a little bit harder to actually get rid of, especially if you're working at a company that's not publicly traded? Additionally, note that these are the top tier companies. These are the companies that pay the most. So there are going to be a ton of companies that pay a lot less than this. This is just sort of the max that you could expect as an entry-level developer in San Francisco. And if we do look at some of the other cities that are high cost of living, for example, Seattle, you'll see we have fairly similar data. So if we go to entry level, we'll see LinkedIn in Seattle is the highest paying according to this at about $222,000. So about a $30,000 difference. But when you account for the difference in taxes, which we'll look at in a minute, it's actually about the exact same. And interestingly, if we go to New York City, it's going to be a little bit different. So if we go to entry level here, you'll see there's a couple that are way higher up here at the top. So we have Jane Street and Hudson River Trading specifically. So these are going to be hedge funds that, for one, are just very small companies. So they don't actually employ that many people, but also they just tend to pay extremely well. Now, that said, anecdotally from people I've talked to who have worked at different hedge funds in New York City, you do sort of work for that extra compensation. So it's not very uncommon for people to be working like 60-hour weeks at these jobs compared to a typical 40-hour work week, which sort of accounts for making so much more money. Now, of course, all of this data is before taxes. So how much of this money do you actually get to keep? Well, this is on Smart Asset. This is an income tax calculator. So if you make $250,000 in San Francisco, which would be sort of the top of that range for a new graduate, you would actually end up keeping about $160,000 of it. So the rest of it would end up going to taxes. So you're going to pay nearly $100,000 per year in taxes. And if we go to New York City, it's actually going to be very similar. So New York, you'll see we also keep just under $160,000. Now, interestingly, a bit of a sweet spot tends to be Seattle. So if we look at Seattle, there's actually no state income tax in Washington. So it means you can keep a lot more. So you get $180,000 if you're able to make that $250,000 salary. Of course, like we saw, these salaries in Seattle do tend to be just a little bit lower than they are in San Francisco. So if, say, you make about 220,000 instead of 250,000, well, now you're back to that $160,000 number. So once you account for taxes, you end up with basically the same result, assuming that you have about that $30,000 difference in how much money you're actually making. But like I said, the taxes aren't the end of it. You also are just living in one of the most expensive cities in the country. So this is the current cost of living by city, and you can see in the United States, New York City is actually the most expensive city to live in. So even if you have that high hedge fund salary, you're going to be paying a lot in taxes, and just all of your expenses will be very high. San Francisco is then number 2, and Seattle's not far behind at number 6. So all of these are very high cost of living areas, as are most of the highest paying tech jobs in the United States. And if we look at the cost of living in New York City specifically, it's very high, and to a lot of people that have never lived in New York or even in the United States, it can be pretty shocking. So of course this can vary a lot based on your own circumstances, but this says a single person is estimated to have monthly costs of $1,600 and a family of 4 of $6,100 in New York City. And that does not count rent. So if we come down all the way down here to the bottom, we're going to see the rent for an apartment. So a 1-bedroom apartment in the city center in New York City is about $4,000 per month. So that is just a lot of money to be spending on rent every single month. And personally, I know people who are spending a lot more than that, and even who have roommates. So if you don't want to have a huge commute to get to work every day, you are likely going to be paying just an exorbitant amount of money for rent. And these are not super luxurious buildings that you're living in. And if we go to San Francisco, you'll see something similar. So let's look at San Francisco, California. You'll see here, the average costs are about $1,573 per month, not counting rent, and $5,690 if you do have a family of 4. And then if we look at rent, it is saying that rent is going to be about $3,000 per month in San Francisco for a 1-bedroom. And again, personally, I do know people in this area who spend a lot more than this on rent, and that's not them like balling out on some big penthouse apartment. It's just them living what most people would consider to be a pretty standard lifestyle. But okay, let's say you have one of these high-paying jobs making $250,000 in the San Francisco area. And then say your rent is $3,000 a month and your monthly expenses are $1,500 a month. That would put you at roughly $4,500 a month in expenses, or about $54,000 per year. Now, of course, this doesn't account for taking any vacations, or maybe you have a lot of debt to actually get that degree that you needed to get this high-paying job, right? A lot of people have a ton of student loan debt, or maybe you have some medical debt, or you're helping out family or something else, right? This is not accounting for any of this. This is just assuming that you are a single person with these sort of average expenses and nothing on top. And of course, if you were in New York City, you'd assume that the expenses would be a little bit higher, and in Seattle, they might be a little bit lower, but we'll just use these numbers for now. So remember, of our 250,000, we kept about 160,000 after taxes. And then we spent about $54,000 per year on expenses. Let's assume we have a few other miscellaneous things that might come up. That's going to mean we're going to save about $100,000 per year. And of course, this is going to be before things like 401k contributions or any debt that you might have to pay off. And also, this doesn't account for the fact that a lot of the compensation was in stock, and sometimes this is stock that you can't actually sell. So if you're saving $100,000, but say $60,000 of it was stock, you really aren't saving that much money comparative to your salary if you aren't able to ever sell that stock. But of course, you're not going to stay an entry-level developer forever, so let's look at what the other levels actually look like. So the first promotion will be to a software engineer 2. This is usually 2 to 5 years of experience, but sometimes it can be earlier. So this is what I was promoted to before I left my job at Facebook. If we can see in San Francisco, the highest paying companies are around $380,000, but Databricks is a bit of an outlier here. If we look at the other ones, they're about $340,000, and then of course they go down. And I think most people around this level tend to be around that $250,000 to $300,000 range if they're working in big tech. And if you have more years of experience, you might make more. And if you have less years of experience, you might make a bit less. And it's also worth noting that as you get to these higher levels, a lot more of your compensation becomes stock. So for example, with Databricks, you're making $380,000 a year, but $175,000 of that is stock compensation that you might value differently. So for example, with this Databricks job, you're really making about $205,000 per year in actual cash and $175,000 per year in Databricks stock. But Databricks is not a publicly traded company, so it's sort of up in the air if that $175,000 is actually worth $175,000, or potentially it's worth zero if they never have an IPO, or potentially could just be worth less when they eventually IPO, or it could be worth a lot more. It's sort of like a bit of a lottery ticket, and it's hard to actually put a real valuation on that. But that said, some of these jobs will be at publicly traded companies. So for example, Facebook here at $327,000, and you can see about 100,000 of that is of stock, but Facebook is a publicly traded company, and it's a company that has a pretty good track record, so I think it's easier to assume that that $100,000 is actually going to be worth roughly $100,000. And historically speaking, it's actually more likely that it would actually end up being worth more by the time you go to sell it, not less. But again, it is sort of like a bit of a lottery ticket or betting on your company to actually do well. But anyways, the point is simply that once you get to software engineer 2, you might make somewhere in the realm of like $30,000 to $50,000 extra per year. And by the time you've been a software engineer 2 for a few years, that number might be more like $50,000 to $75,000 extra. And again, that is before taxes. Then once you get to a senior engineer, this is where the numbers get a lot higher. So this is 5+ years of experience. And you can see there's companies paying well north of $500,000 for senior developers. That said, there's a huge range here. So there's senior developers who have 5 years of experience, and there's senior developers who have 25 years of experience. And those ones with 25 years of experience might have the same job title, but they are making a lot more money. So don't expect to get this promotion, say 5 years into your career, and then magically be making north of $500,000. It's possible, but most likely that's not actually going to be the case. Additionally, by the time most people get to this level of senior engineer, usually they are later in their careers, meaning that they are also just older. And as you get older, you tend to have more life responsibilities, whether it be kids or medical things to deal with, or if you're helping out different people in your family, and just expenses tend to be getting a lot higher as you get older. So you might be making a lot more money, but you also might be saving less money, or at least spending a higher amount of money and cutting into that extra money that you are making. But okay, what I want to look at next is how much money we can actually be saving as one of these high-paid software engineers. And a lot of this comes down to compound interest. And a lot of the reason why I think software engineering is such an amazing field is because you can make a lot of money early in your career, which gives you a lot of time to compound that money and make a lot more money. So let's take a look at an example. If you were one of these high-paid software engineers living in Silicon Valley, working at a Google, Facebook type of company where you can make a lot of money. Let's say initially you have $0 saved up. Maybe in some cases you might actually have negative money saved up if you have debt from student loans and things like that. But let's say we're starting at 0. And let's say for the first 2 years of our career, we are an entry-level developer. We're going to get a 7% rate of return on our investments, which is fairly standard if you're just investing in index funds. And let's say that each month we're going to contribute $8,400. So this is roughly $100,000 per year that we will contribute. And let's say we do this every single month, compounding annually. And you can see this means that after our 2 years, we will have saved $208,000. So $201,000 is what we actually contributed, and our interest was about $7,000. And let's say from here we get a promotion and we start saving a bit more money. So let's say now we have our $208,000 that has been saved up. And let's say for the next 3 years, we're going to be a mid-level developer. Let's say we save $10,000 per month as that mid-level developer. Now we're going to have $640,000 saved. So we have contributed a little bit over $500,000 and gotten a little bit over $70,000 in interest. And I know these numbers might seem a little bit absurd, and quite frankly, they sort of are, but it is absolutely possible. I do know a lot of people who have done this, who have gone to these big tech companies directly out of college, who have graduated with no debt, whether it be from scholarships or just getting help from family to pay for college. And essentially this means that they're able to save like $100,000 per year and start compounding that money very, very early. But okay, so this is where it can get super crazy. So let's say we now have our $640,000 saved up, and it's been about 5 years of our career. Let's say we want to have a 35-year career, so we have 30 years remaining. And let's say for the remaining 30 years, we just stay at the same rate. Well, that would give us $16 million. But we know that at this point, we're going to be a senior engineer. So maybe we up this to say, let's say $15,000 per month, which would be a lot of contribution. But if you do get to that level of making like $500,000 every single year, this is absolutely possible. And you could end up retiring with $21 million. Now, of course, this isn't always possible because there's sort of lifestyle inflation where people start spending more money as they make more money. And just as we get older, like I said, people tend to have kids, people tend to go on vacations, they tend to help out with their families. And all of these things can cause them to have a lot more in expenses. Maybe this entire time we only save like $5,000 per month. But hey, we would still end up with like $10 million. And a lot of this is due to the fact that when we were young, we saved up so much money early on in our career. Now, a few things to note about this. First of all, I don't think there's that many people who exist who are essentially this exact example. First of all, just most people tend to have other expenses in life, whether it be their student loans or whatever it might be, that prevent them from saving quite this much money. Additionally, most people, if they are able to save this much money, choose to just retire, right? Like if you had, say, $10 million and you're in your 30s, you're probably just going to retire rather than continuing to work a 9-to-5 job to get that next $10 million. It just doesn't really make that much sense because the marginal value to your life isn't that high and you're spending a lot of time on that job. Additionally, the industry is not that old, so there's not that many people who are at the end of this, say, 35 year cycle where you could end up with like $20 million from all of this compound interest because 30 or 35 years ago, there weren't salaries like this in tech. And there's also no guarantee that 30 years from now, these types of salaries will exist. They could be significantly lower, or they could even be significantly higher. But there's just no guarantee that this is actually how it ends up playing out just because it is such a new industry. So it's hard to really make these bold predictions, but if everything stayed exactly like it is, you could end up saving a ton of money by the time you get to retirement if you work one of these high-paying jobs in Silicon Valley. It's also worth noting that this is not the norm, and I think a lot of content online, and I'm probably responsible for some small portion of this as well, tends to sort of push this idea that this is in some way the norm, that a huge portion of software engineers are working at Google and Facebook and these big tech companies making a ton of money, which a lot of them are, but there are far more software engineers working elsewhere. There are far more software engineers making half this amount of money, even within the United States, because most don't live in these super high cost of living areas and most don't work for these big tech companies. And even in Silicon Valley, where the cost of living, like we said, is very high, I know plenty of new grads who make somewhere in the range of like $100,000 to $140,000 per year before taxes, which still sounds like a lot of money, but by the time you're done paying the taxes on that and paying for the just super high cost of living in Silicon Valley, you actually aren't left with that much to actually save. So for example, coming back to our income tax calculator, if you make $135,000 in San Francisco, which is still a ton of money, you're going to be left with $92,000 as your take-home pay. And we said our expenses are going to be somewhere in the realm of like $50,000 to $60,000 per year, living a fairly standard lifestyle in San Francisco, which would leave us with like $30,000 to $40,000 of money to save. And again, a big portion of this still might end up just being stock in a company that's not publicly traded. And don't get me wrong, that is still a lot of money to save, and you will end up with a huge retirement even doing that. But it is just different than sort of this top end number that we oftentimes see floating around. And then if we get away from these high cost of living areas and look at, say, a medium cost of living area like Atlanta, you'll see the salaries are a good bit lower. So the top level for an entry-level developer in Atlanta looks like it's about $175,000. And you can see most companies that are even on this leaderboard are closer to $100,000 for entry-level developers. And then software engineer 2 is going to be about $250,000 for the very top level at Google and Amazon. But then when you get away from that, it quickly goes down to below 200,000, and even a lot of companies in the 150 to 160 range for these mid-level developers. And then senior developers at the top level still going to be Google and Amazon over 300,000. But very quickly, you see a lot of numbers in the 200,000s, and if we scroll down further, you'll see senior developers making like $120,000, $130,000, $150,000, and that is still considered very good money. Again, this is a leaderboard of the best paying companies, and there's a good chance that you will not work at one of the 20 best paying companies in your area. So while it's fun to look at these super high paying salaries in Silicon Valley, New York, and Seattle, do you know that the vast majority of people, even working in those areas, aren't getting paid those super high salaries? And the vast majority of software engineers just across the country aren't anywhere near those salaries. Even in fairly high cost of living cities like Atlanta that are still very expensive to live in, the majority of people are making good money, don't get me wrong, but it's not this absolutely insane money that we sometimes see. It's also important to remember that a lot of software engineers don't work for tech companies. So many different companies need software engineering, right? Like almost every company has an app or a website. Think about a bank or an airline and how complicated their different systems are, as well as how complicated their apps and websites are. And they have software engineers who are building these, but they likely aren't going to pay nearly as high as these traditional tech companies actually would. Additionally, a lot of these jobs aren't going to be in Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. They're going to be in wherever wherever that company is actually based, which oftentimes are much lower cost of living areas. So for example, somebody might be making $60,000 as a software engineer, but living in an extremely low cost of living area, and that could be a trade-off that's worth taking for you as an individual if that's an area you like to live in, and if you feel like you can live comfortably on that salary. I've even met some senior software engineers in some of these low cost of living areas who swear by the fact that even if they only make, say, $100,000, $120,000 as a senior, that their standard of living is actually much higher than somebody, say, in the Bay Area making way more money than them, but with way more expenses and everything else that comes with living in the Bay. So I want to look at sort of a low cost of living example and see how much money we could save there. So let's say we make $75,000 living in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So this is going to be probably in the realm of a medium software engineering salary, at least over the course of a career. As a new grad, it might be a little less, and as a senior, it's definitely going to be more. But let's say we're making about $75,000. We would be taking home about $58,000 after taxes. And if we look at the cost of living in Oklahoma City, we have monthly costs of about $1,200 for a single person or $4,200 for a family of 4. But what's really different here is going to be the rent. So if we go to rent per month, a 1-bedroom apartment here is less than $1,300 a month versus in New York City where you might spend like $4,000 a month for probably a less nice apartment. So let's say the take-home pay we have per month is going to be roughly $5,000 and our expenses are roughly $2,500. This means we are saving $2,500 per month. And let's say we do this for, say, 25 years. This would give us $1.8 million after 25 years. And if we did this for an entire career, 35 years, that'd give us a $4 million retirement off of $75,000 per year in Oklahoma. Now, of course, again, your exact scenario may differ a lot. You might have more expenses early on to repay some debt, and you might have more expenses later on in your career as you have kids and things like that. You also, though, might end up making more money as your career progresses. For example, I wouldn't expect you to still be making $75,000 35 years into a software engineering career. Most likely, you would be making significantly more than that at that point. And really, the overall point is simply to say that at least within the United States, are software engineers all rich? No, of course not. Are there some that are very rich? Yes, there are. There are some who got very lucky with stock, say you worked at Nvidia early on, or there's some who've just stayed in their career for a very long time, although not that many of them just because not that old of a field. And of course, there's some who went on to become founders and make a ton of money that way. But living the typical software engineering life in the United States, are you going to become super, super rich from that? No, probably not. But can you make a great amount of money and save a good portion of that money and become fairly wealthy by the time you reach retirement? Yes, absolutely you can. And outside of the United States, I think things tend to look fairly similar, not in the actual numbers, because again, salaries in the US just tend to be a lot higher, but simply in the fact that are most software engineers going to be rich? No, probably not. However, the vast majority of them are going to be living very comfortably and will have a comfortable retirement by the time that time comes. That said, there are huge differences in how pay works in the US versus other countries, and that causes these salaries to be very, very different. If you're curious as to how exactly that works and why the US salaries are so much higher, you should watch this video next. And if you're curious about how some software engineers are finding ways to make extra money on the side, you should watch this video next.